This is your boy Delonte West, and you're listening to CLNSRadio. Now back to you, B. Paul and Nick.
This is Nick Sannicandro here. I am the former beat writer for North Station Sports, soon to be joining the CLNSRadio blog. I am currently working on a Celtics history book. I'm joined today with Nick Gelso, the co-host of Celtics Late Night Show and the co-owner of CLNSRadio. Nick, how are you doing today?
Good, Nicky. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
You know, we're going to talk today a little bit about the Celtics history in the 80s. Let's talk first about your history with the Celtics and how you've come about to be a Celtics fan.
Oh man, growing up, I grew up in a household that had the God forbid me say the Yankees at number one and the Celtics at above the Yankees. So we were a family of Celtics and Yankees fans, if that even makes sense. But keep in mind, I am from Pennsylvania, so the hate for the Yankees may not be quite as evident as it would be for those who live in Boston. So my father and my brother and family raised me on the Celtics. I remember as a young boy watching the 85 and 86 finals, and they're my first memories of basketball. And since then, I've almost become a collector of history, Nick. I have collected over 300 games from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and studied the history, and would like to say that I have a good knowledge or a good grasp on the history of the Celtics that makes a lot of people think that I am older than I am. As a kid in high school, I remember, Mickey, I used to, obviously there was no league pass back then, and there was no way to get Celtics games unless they were on live television, and I couldn't take not one. So I would literally stay up until after the game and record all the highlights on every channel, including the local channels here in Scranton, PA, and at the end of the season, I would have a full compilation tape of every highlight that was ever played of that season, and that was through 87 through 93, 94 maybe. So yeah, I've been a collector of history and really followed history almost more passionately than I've followed the present at sometimes. Obviously, the Celtics have had rough years over the past, 2 decades, 2 decades, and so we're glad to be back in the elite category of the NBA, and I'm glad to be here to be able to talk about some of my memories and some of the research I've done over the years.
Well, like you said, your history and knowledge of the Celtics history stands out compared to many. That's why that I decided to bring you in, and that's part of what's made both CLNSRadio and the Celtics Late Night Show a tremendous program and website for useful information on the Celtics. It's really a terrific website, and obviously you've done a ton to promote the website and the show, and you've done a ton of work, and you have some great writers on there. But again, your knowledge of the team's history, and especially of the league history, stands out among most. I want to get. I
appreciate that. Let me interrupt you 1 second. I do appreciate that. And it's a nice. The Celtics Late Night Show. Quickly, if I could get a quick shameless plug, it's a nice, interesting contrast because my co-host is obviously considerably younger than me. And his first memories are, the Paul Pierce era, Ricky Davis, and some of the lesser times of the Celtics, and that doesn't diminish him as a fan, but it does add a interesting contrast when the two of us are together on the air, on the mic, because he's more of, I think, the type of person that you're trying to market to with the book. You're looking at taking current-day Celtics fans and educating them on what is one of the richest histories in all of sports. That's
exactly the goal of this book that I'm working on. I feel that after we've brought the Celtics back to relevancy after a scary bout of irrelevancy in the 90s and early 2000s, we have a lot of new fans in the Celtics fan base, and a lot of them don't know about, they know vague details about the 50s and 60s and obviously 70s and 80s, and that's the goal of this book, is to provide some interesting tidbits on some of these key players, Bill Russell and Bob Cousy. You can go down the list, Jim Loscatoff, as well as some funny stories that I may have come across in my studies. And that's why this interview is especially important, because this is coming from a fan's perspective that lived in that in the glory years of the Celtics. The glory years too. Obviously, the first glory years were in the 60s, but the second bout of glory years in Celtics history in the 80s. And that's really where I want to start off. Is in the 80s, and the 80s rolled in with the Celtics holding the number 1 and the number 13 picks in the draft. They sent these picks off to Golden State for Robert Parish in the number 3 pick, and they turned that into Kevin McHale. Let's talk a little bit about this move and what it meant to the organization.
Well, obviously, it's been considered one of the greatest or more cunning, shrewd trades in NBA history, brought in by Red Auerbach. Larry Bird obviously had come in the year prior, and Dave Cowens was on his way out, dealing with physical issues, and in the past he had some issues with depression as well. So Red pretty much tackled bringing in a brand new front line while keeping the current Cedric Maxwell on the floor as a starter. He brought in what would be, I think, the 3-time Sixth Man of the Year, Kevin McHale. And I believe, it's my belief, that the number 2 pick ended up being Joe Barry Carroll. So he did pretty well by trading away the rights to that and bringing in McHale, who ended up being one of the best low-post players in NBA history. Yeah,
I agree completely. McHale's numbers are stunning, and a lot of people have the issue of thinking that McHale came in and started right away. They don't realize that he actually spent a lot of time on the bench. Like you said, he won the Sixth Man numerous times. My notes, he won it in 81 and 84. He came off the bench for a long period of time before he was the full-time starter. And looking at some of his numbers in his peak, his 2-year peak was where he was averaging 24 points, 9 rebounds, and 3 assists a game, and he was shooting about 60% from the field. Those are some terrific numbers.
That free throw line. Kevin McHale, I believe in 90 or 89, was one of the only players in NBA history to shoot 80% from the line, 60% from the field, and average 20 points a game. So McHale, by the time his career was starting to maybe peak at his prime, he had mastered most of the offensive sets of the game. And let's not forget, he was an all-defensive player several times as well. McHale is an underrated, and until recently, when he has now gone on television, almost an underappreciated contributor to the history of the game.
Yeah, I love the fact that you brought up the free throws. He's actually a career 80% free throw shooter, which is rare for a big man, especially nowadays where Shaq was shooting, below 40% for most of his career from the free throw line. So, like you said, he was a terrific free throw shooter. His career from the field, he's 55%, which is, again, that's terrific for a big man. That would lead the league in most seasons. Let's talk a little bit about what McHale's game was. A lot of people talk about the post-up moves, and that's really what stands out the most about McHale. What do you remember about watching Kevin McHale play?
Oh my goodness, Larry Bird is obviously my favorite ball player of all time, but Kevin McHale, what he did in that low post was not just dominant, it was interesting. Because you don't see players today with a repertoire of, 5 to 6 distinctive moves. His long arms and big hands allowed him to really manipulate the ball and get inside of defenders and get to that free throw line. Kevin McHale, when he put you in that torture chamber in that low post, you were either fouling him, he was going to the line and making two, or he was just going to shoot over you with his long arms. And the other side of that, and the side that is forgotten with Kevin McHale, is that he was the best defender on that team, and without a doubt on the front line, he was the best defender. McHale guarded the 3, the 4, and the 5 position in his prime with ease for the most part. Kevin McHale was, he's number 2 on my list. Watching that man play, you knew when he was getting the ball on the block, it was either going in or he was getting fouled. He was certainly not passing it. He didn't lead the league in assists. And as Kevin got older, his jump shooting ability improved. He was able to hit the 25-footer, the 20-foot jump shot, which made it even more difficult to guard. So you're looking at a guy there who, as his skill set started to disintegrate with age and injury, you're looking at a guy who expanded his skill set to be able to compensate for that. And let's not forget the true grit. When I think of Kevin McHale, I think of my, again, early memories as a kid watching basketball and hearing about a man who was playing throughout the entire playoffs on a broken foot. And that was during his prime. He was jeopardizing the rest of his career for a title run.
Yeah, I was just about to bring that up, actually. The 86-87 postseason, it was a broken left foot, not a sprain or anything. This thing was broken, and his career was on the line. I mean, you see with Bill Walton later in his career that the feet in basketball are an important tool, and once your feet start to break down, you're in big trouble. So to continue to play on a broken foot is, obviously painful, but you're risking your career at that point. And then, later in the Detroit series, I believe he was in a situation where some of the Detroit players were actually purposely stepping on that broken foot.
On his feet. Yeah,
exactly. So this was a serious concern for Celtics fans at the time, and the guy just gritted it out and fought through the pain, and he did what was best for the team. Who would you compare Kevin McHale to as a modern day player?
Oh man, I always said Tim Duncan because Duncan he's a lost breed as well. I mean, with his back to the basket, he was nearly unstoppable. He had the bank shot off the backboard. He had 3 to 4 distinctive moves. I always compared him to Duncan in his prime. Today, the game has become so perimeter-oriented and so reliant upon athleticism, which I think is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's good to watch athletic players, but a lot of that finesse that went on in the big man's game is now gone. The big men want to shoot perimeter shots as well, which is taking the art out of the low post and must absolutely infuriate or frustrate a guy like McHale when he's watching today's basketball games. But I would probably say Duncan.
Okay, yeah,
Duncan has a good grasp on the low post.
Duncan is like one of those, he's one of those throwback players. You don't see many of him anymore. But staying on the topic of big men, we see with the current big three in the Celtics, Ray Allen, Kevin Garnett, and Pierce. When they were brought together, Ray Allen was kind of the I don't want to say underdog, but he kind of was the forgotten member of the big three. All the attention went to, obviously, Kevin Garnett at first, and how this was Paul Pierce's team. And not a lot of people brought up Ray Allen's name and what he was going to bring to the team. Obviously, we know that now. But a guy that, I think that fits that category is Robert Parish. When you talk about the old big three in the 80s, I hate to call them old, but the old big three, you hear about Larry Bird and how great Larry Bird was.
The original big three.
The original, that's a better. The original big three. You hear about, Larry Bird. That goes without a doubt just to how great Larry Bird was, and obviously Kevin McHale. You hear a lot of, but you don't hear a lot about Robert Parish. Let's talk a little bit about Parish and, what he brought to the Celtics and what his game was all about.
You kind of have to go all the way back to his Golden State days. He played alongside of a guy that we as Celtics fans have come to know well and admire and now miss, and that would be Clifford Ray. Parish, throughout his career, and especially as he grew into, and Parish's growth into an all-star player was years, it was years in the making. So when it finally happened, the Chief always credited Clifford Ray for taking him under his wing, showing him how to work out, take care of himself. See, Parish had a knock on him with Golden State that he was lazy. And he even had it in his first probably season with the Celtics. Though I believe he averaged 20 points a game. Parish was kind of sought as, you know, someone who maybe didn't dive for the loose ball. You know what? By the time his career was winding down in Boston, and of course, eventually he went on to free agency, but by the time his career was winding down in Boston, Robert Parish was playing through pain, another man who suffered through numerous ankle injuries, but always played. The backbone of the Big Three, the original Big Three, because Parish was a constant. Though he had injuries, his conditioning, which went back to Clifford Ray, gave him the ability to play through that pain, rehab while playing, and allowed him to play more games than the other two, which would be McHale and Bird. And towards the latter years, as Bird really started to taper off with injuries, and McHale as well, went back to, don't forget, Kevin McHale went back to the six-man role later in his career. The Chief really, at one point in the early and mid-'80s, he was the fifth option on the team. By the time the early 90s rolled around, he was a third option offensively. And the Chief came through. His first Sports Illustrated cover issue, I think, was in 1991. So at that point, he was 37 years old. So Robert Parish was the stability and the backbone of that front line and those championship teams, and certainly the most underrated of all of them, possibly with the exception of Dennis Johnson. Robert Parish will be never given the credit that he deserves as a major contributor to the history of the game.
Well, longevity is, I don't even think that's the word for Robert Parish. You know, people forget that he actually played on some of the middle of his career Michael Jordan teams as a center for the Bulls, and you know, the guy averaged for 12 seasons, he averaged over 15 points a game and 9 rebounds. That's a model of consistency, you know, statistically speaking. I think a moment of Parish that stands out most with Celtics fans from the 80s is one of the rare displays of aggression from Robert Parish, one of the rare lapse of control and anger, the incident with Bill Laimbeer. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Now that's a game that I remember like it was yesterday. The VCR remote had a cord on it that hooked up to the VCR, and you had to, in order for me to cut out, and I'm breaking NBA rules here by recording NBA games back in the 80s, but in order to edit out the commercials, pause the record key, I would have to stand by the VCR the entire time, like the remote served no purpose. So I remember that like it was yesterday, and really indicative of the way the game has changed, because Parish wasn't even ejected from that game. Eventually, I think he was suspended for Game 6 of that series because of the incident. But you're looking at a guy who was pretty much acting up his teammates. You talked about the bad boys stepping on McHale's feet on purpose. You know, there's images of Laimbeer taking cheap shots at Bird and McHale, and Robert Parish had pretty much had enough and put him on the ground, and Laimbeer cried. And as a Celtics fan, it was like, yeah, because we were the powerhouse of the Eastern Conference, and the Detroit Pistons, they were the up-and-coming team. So he slammed him to the ground, and it was like, you ain't so bad right now, are you, Laimbeer? So then, of course, the rest of the series, and actually up in the early 90s when they met the Pistons in 91, those Laimbeer pictures of him crying were always given out going into the Garden, the old Garden. And those are great memories. And the younger fans remember that as Parish's maybe defining moment, or the moment that's seen most on highlight tapes. But my God, there were so many more. Big block shots. He was a clutch shooter. People underestimate his free throw shooting. Early in his career, he was not a good free throw shooter. By the mid and late 80s, he was in the upper 70s. He had an ugly shot, but it went in. And then also mentoring the younger players. And he did that quite frequently. So Robert Parish should never be forgotten, and he is a legend, and not just to the Celtics, but to the NBA as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier on, and I know that they play different positions, but the way that Parish is described historically reminds me a lot of what Ray Allen brings to this team, that kind of quiet leadership, the mentoring, and the toughness when he needs it. You see little flashes from Ray Allen of that toughness, and so if you're going to compare a guy in terms of attitude and the way he conducts himself, it sounds like Robert Parish and Ray Allen are almost equals on that scale.
You can certainly make the comparison personality-wise. When you're on a front line with Larry Bird, it's very difficult for you to outshine anyone. So why try? You just play your game and you lead by example. A lot of what Ray does. But when it was crunch time, let's make no mistake. Sure, DJ made huge shots. Chiefs made huge shots. McHale made big shots. But the ball was in Larry Bird's hands. And the difference between that era and this era is crunch time. I would say 6 times out of 10, the ball's usually in Ray Allen's hands. The other 4 times you see an isolation with Paul Pierce. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yep.
But Ray has more of the ability to be able to come through in the big moments, where Parish did more in a subtle fashion, blocking a shot, defending Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, to a point where it would be a standstill. And don't forget, Robert Parish had enormously difficult defensive assignments. I mean, you're talking about an era that was dominated by the big man. So you had Hakeem Olajuwon. I mean, in '86, the Celtics beat the Rockets. They had the Twin Towers. They had, 7'10" Ralph Sampson, and Hakeem Olajuwon played the power forward position. I mean, those guys had their hands full on defense. So different, but I see the analogy with Ray, personality-wise.
Terrific comparisons and terrific reference. A lot of people do forget that Robert Parish grew as a player in what, like you said, if not the most stacked era of centers. Like you listed off just a couple of the names, but that era was just filled with pure talent at the center position. Whereas today,
Patrick Ewing, you could go right down the list. You're not talking about, Wilt and Russell, who dominate, 2 big men who dominated the game. You're talking about, 10 or 12 guys roaming the paint that were just monsters, And here's quiet Robert Parish defending them to a standstill. And no one really talks about the defense. They talk about the fact that Kareem had a bad game.
Yeah, it's nothing.
Olajuwon had a bad game. No, it was the defense.
It's nothing like today's NBA, where the biggest name at center is Dwight Howard and then maybe Greg Oden.
Right.
It's definitely times have changed. Bill, staying in the '80s, in the early '80s, Bill Fitch was the coach early on in the '80s. This is really the first time. It actually is the first time that the Celtics went out of the organization. Previous teams were coached obviously by Red Auerbach and Bill Russell, Tommy Heinsohn, Satch Sanders, Dave Cowens. This is the first time the Celtics brought in a guy that maybe was outside of the organization, and it was one of the few times historically, after Bill Fitch, you see a couple of former players come back. But let's talk a little bit about Bill Fitch and what his coaching style was, what he brought to the team, and let's hear a little bit about Bill Fitch.
I think that before you get into Fitch, you got to kind of talk about the demise of Tommy, and it's a very sensitive subject today because we all love Tommy. I mean, Tommy, he makes Celtics basketball that much better. I mean, he makes it good even when they're bad, just by his commentary. really messed up Dave Cowens, who was behind the scenes in a lot of ways, undermining Tommy. Tommy had a style that was similar to Red's in the way that he had a very small playbook, didn't micromanage his players. People don't realize that about Red, but he didn't. He allowed his players to have a personality and make decisions, and Tommy was very much the same. By the end of the 70s, the leadership was starting to go away because Havlicek were retiring, and you had players coming in that maybe embraced some of the dark days of the NBA, people call it. There was Sidney Rowe and Curtis Wicks, Mad Max, Cedric Maxwell came in at that time, and Tommy's style had kind of allowed these undisciplined players to run wild, and Tommy pretty much lost control. So, bringing Bird, you bring in a new coach, you bring in a new philosophy, totally, and you have Bill Fitch. Well, on a team filled with talent, but maybe devoid of some of the discipline that's needed to win a championship, you bring in a disciplinarian. That was Bill Fitch. Worked well in Bird's style, who was very regimented, very self-motivated, held high standards, and it worked for 2 seasons. But guys like Parish, and particularly McHale and Cedric Maxwell, just didn't blend well with Fitch. Not to say he was a bad coach, but the discipline, and that was what he was about, Bill Fitch. It was about discipline. It was about controlling the team. It was about setting standards high because we don't trust our players enough to set the standards high enough.
It's tough. It's tough in sports nowadays. Especially with a disciplinarian coach. They can only, and Red Auerbach is famous for this theory in many of his books, that a disciplinarian, a guy that yells or just keeps pounding the same point home, eventually guys start to tune his message out.
Right, it's like a record that plays over and over. You stop listening after a while.
Exactly, and it's not as effective anymore. Is that what we would say led to the demise of Bill Fitch as the coach of the Celtics?
From what I've read and what I've seen on playbacks, I would think so. I mean, particularly with Stephen McHale, they certainly didn't see eye to eye on everything. Maxwell as well. You're looking at the MVP of the finals in 1981. By 1983, he was kind of I don't know. By 84, he made a little rebound because he put the team on his back in the NBA finals and beat the Lakers. By 85, he was gone. So, granted, we had moved into the Casey Jones era at that point, but the point being, the discipline of Bill Fitch was what catapulted the team to their 14th NBA title in 81, and also had him dismissed by a sweep from the Milwaukee Bucks in 83.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the rare sweeps in Celtics history. You don't see them swept out of the playoffs very often historically, and obviously one of the very few in the original Big Three era. The only other time that we can look upon that is when they lost in the first round in 1989 to Detroit.
Well, that doesn't really count.
That was the end of the era. So it's
well, it was the end of the era, but don't forget, it was the season that Bird sat out.
Exactly.
So you had a team that probably shouldn't have even made the playoffs, entered as the 8th seed, and got swept by the eventual champions. I mean, had Bird been there would be no sweep. 83 getting swept by Milwaukee. The year earlier, 2 years earlier, you were the champion. No, 3 years earlier, you were in the Eastern Conference Finals against the Sixers in Bird's first year. A year later, you're the champion. A year after that, you're in the Eastern Conference Finals again. And then 83 gets swept by the Bucks.
Yeah,
Don Nelson, no less.
Especially with the Celtics tradition of winning, especially well established at that point, especially coming from the 60s and 70s. It's an unacceptable. we saw in the late 70s where they actually missed the playoffs 2 seasons, and that was the end of the Tommy Heinsohn and Satch Sanders coaching careers. Dave Cowens ended up taking over as the player coach at the end of that 79 season, and that was a disaster again and again. They missed the playoffs that year. You briefly touched upon when Bill Fitch left, the next guy to take over for him was Casey Jones. Casey actually won the championship in his first season as a coach, and historically, Casey Jones was a terrific. He was a terrific success story as a coach. Let's talk a little bit about Casey Jones as the coach. We know about Casey Jones as the player, but I'm curious to hear what you think about him as a coach.
And let's not forget he was an assistant. So we talk about Bill Fitch being the only non-Celtic. Well, he had right on his right or his left on the bench with Casey Jones, a Hall of Fame, 6 or 7 time champion with the team. So Casey had been on the bench for a while, but here we are now. Bird's in it's 84. Bird's in his 5th season, 4th or 5th season. I don't know how you look at that. He came in 79. So McHale's in his 4th season. Parish is in his 8th season. So you're looking at guys who are starting to turn into that mentality of the current Big Three. We're in deep, maybe not nearly as deep as they were, because those guys were definitely, in the peak of their prime or on the way down. But on the 80 Celtics teams, it was like we got, and Bird always believed it, we have the best team in the world. Now's the time to do it. Well, you bring in a guy, you get Fitch goes, which really did hurt Bird. Bird loved Bill Fitch, but understood the reasons for letting him go. Bring in Casey Jones. Now we're back to Celtic style. Not bad enough for Fitch. Fitch was good for what they needed at that time. But you bring in Casey Jones, you got a guy who gives the players the freedom to make decisions again. Throwback to Tommy and Red. And these guys had the ability, the responsibility, the discipline, the determination to say there's nothing more important than winning the title in 84. Perfect coach, perfect timing, perfect players to react to a very liberal coach, players coach, let's put it that way. I really honestly think Doc is maybe a bit more outspoken than Casey ever was, but very similar styles in coaching. There wasn't a play, and that was one of the things after Bird retired. He said the problem about today's game is it's so ran by the coaches. The coaches call plays every set down the court. Well, that wasn't Casey Jones' style, and it's certainly not. He lets Ron make decisions and make mistakes. It's part of growing. And Casey Jones was one of those guys. He stuck up for his players. He allowed them to make decisions. He allowed them to play a little bit of freelance basketball. And for God's sakes, when you got a guy like Larry Bird on your team, and he comes into the huddle, and there's 3 seconds left in the game, and you're down 1, and he says, "Give me the ball," and everybody get out of the way, makes decisions a little bit easier. You listen to the legend.
Well, that was,
Casey is being loved in Boston.
That was, you touch upon his coaching philosophy. That was actually Red Auerbach's philosophy as well as a coach. Kind of, you don't really have a need for set plays, and Auerbach states numerous times that they had at most 3 or 4 plays for their team, and that's all that they needed. And he needed to have players that knew what they were doing on the floor and knew how to react to situations. And unfortunately, in today's game, you see more plays than anything, and I think the exception to that rule is the Celtics right now, where 80% of the plays that they run right now are made up on the fly. Another important part that made Casey Jones such a success as a coach, the guy knew how to win, and you can't just find that kind of person on the street. The guy won 8 straight championships as a player, and what stands out most is as a coach, he not only has a 522 and 252 record as a coach in 11 seasons, which counts for a 67% winning percentage, but his teams made the playoffs in all but 1 season, and that was his final season coaching, and that was with the Seattle Supersonics.
Seattle?
Yeah, so 10 seasons as a coach, he made the playoffs out of 11. You know.
Oh, and you look at his days with Boston, Nick. Excuse me. All but one season, they were in the finals.
Yeah.
85, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, the year that they met Detroit again, and certainly beaten them had Bird been healthy. That was the only season that they didn't make the finals, but they did make the Eastern Conference Finals. But you're looking at a guy there who's intelligent enough to know that he has players on his team, on his squad, with high basketball IQ and the drive to win the title. And you made the analogy of today's team with the Celtics. They may be the only team in the league, blah, 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 blah. Well, you're right, and you're also right about the fact that you have veteran players who want to win, who will do anything to win, and it makes it a little bit easier, not discounting what these guys have done. I mean, these head coaches. I mean, Doc is an amazing coach. And KC was the right guy, again, with the right players in the right era and the right style.
Exactly. And, you know, it just takes the right coach at the right time to have that explosion of success that we can obviously see that Casey Jones had. You know, staying in the 80s again, during the 80s, especially the early 80s, there was some intense battles with the Philadelphia 76ers. You know, obviously early on, the Wilt and Russell days, there was some battles, but nothing like this in the early 80s. And Philly had a guy by the name of Andrew Toney, labeled him as a Celtic killer. Let's talk a little bit about that Philadelphia series and Andrew Toney. And, you know, were there any other of those Celtic killer pest-type players? And what made Toney specifically and these types of players so effective against this team?
Well, the Boston Strangler, Andrew Toney, he was a street shooter who could hit everything. He was Ray Allen 25 years earlier. The Celtics had a great defensive team. When you look at even right, you know, from AJ, who was all defense, Parish, who was a great defender, McHale was all defense. Don't forget Bird was all defense too. And at that time, Gerald Henderson, I think, was manning the 2 spot. Andrew Toney terrorized them, and don't forget, as a team, your whole focus is on Dr. J and Moses Malone. None of this guy, Andrew Toney's going to come out of nowhere and beat the Christ out of you. He strangled them. So, I mean, that was a lot of what it was, and those early 80s battles are often forgotten as far as rivalries. You got to think about the Celtics in 81, they came back from 3-1 down. In 82, they were 3-1 down, and I think took it to 7 games and lost. But those series were just classic, and Andrew Toney was one of those guys that you knew he was a good player, but when you were a Celtics fan and you were watching the game, you were expecting Dr. J and Moses Malone to go off, or you know, Chocolate Thunder to break the backboard, and you know, Andrew Toney is beating the Christ out of you. It's one of those moments where, you know, stars are made, and it's defining for a guy like Andrew Toney. I wonder where he is now. You don't hear anything about him.
That would be a good segment for you know, where are they now that Sports Illustrated actually just put out. You know, but you know, historically, I don't think that you know, he stands out. I think obviously he stands out for Celtics fans just because of you know, the pain that he caused them. And obviously for Philly fans, for the pain that he caused Boston, that they thoroughly enjoyed. But you know, in the grand scheme of things, I think if you asked NBA fans as a whole, you know, you wouldn't hear a ton about Andrew Toney because he really made his claim to fame was just beating up on Boston. Would you agree on that?
Oh, yeah, I totally would. I mean, like I said, always a street shooter, but he shot well at the Garden. You know, who doesn't shoot reasonably well in their own arena? So at the Spectrum, he did well. And with the Celtics, he just abused the Celtics backcourt. And, you know, I mean, it worked for Boston. They beat Philadelphia 1 out of the 3 years, but played them hard in those early years. But those battles shouldn't be forgotten. They're some of the best basketball that's been played in the NBA.
Hey sports fans, Tim Donaghy here from the Sports Connection. I know the NBA better than anybody. That's why you need to call 1-800-308-9003 for today's free pick.
Thanks a lot, Timmy D. It's been a great year. Thanks to you. Guys, this is Danny B. Make sure you pick up that phone like Tim says. Give us a call for today's free pick at 1-800-308-9003 or visit us at DannyBasandBoy.info.
In the Sports Week, airing live every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on CLNSRadio.com. For the next 5 weeks, Crunch Time with Mac Attack is partnering up with our friends at the popular website BustedTees.com to give away a free t-shirt code to one lucky caller each show for the next 5 weeks. BustedTees.com is one of the most well-known shirt designing companies on the web today. And even if you don't win the free shirt, everyone is a winner. Because when you head over to the Crunch Time with Mac Attack show page on CLNSRadio.com and you find the Busted Tees logo in the advertisement section, you will also find yourself a coupon code to be used on the site. So tune in to Crunch Time with Mac Attack, Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, live on CLNSRadio.com for your chance to win a free shirt with free shipping and handling from BustedTees.com. You don't want to miss out on this one.
Nick, the 1985 season is one of interest for the Celtics fans. One of the low points of Celtics history, especially in that time. We had the issue with Cedric Maxwell, which eventually led to his trading at the end of that season, bringing in Bill Walton. You have the Celtics losing on their home floor in the championship for the only time in their storied history. Talk a little bit about that 1985 season.
85. I mean, okay, a lot of let's say big moments. McHale went from being sixth man to a starter. What did that mean? That meant Max, who was suffering from knee problems and also within I believe, and don't quote me here, but I think he was in a contract year, heading to the bench. And unfortunately, Max didn't take well to that and became almost a powder. And Larry Bird has been quoted as saying that Max did not give it his all at times. So he had some morale issues, probably for the first time in the Bird era. And then on top of that, Larry Bird was suffering from an elbow injury that would eventually, in that off season, turn to the injury that ended his career, which would be the back injury. People don't realize that it went back that far, the back injury. So 85, first time any opposing team with a championship on the parquet floor, which it's almost, if you put it in line with the curse for the Red Sox, the Celtics had a mystique. They were, it's the Celtics, so the opposition just can't win, especially the Lakers. And in 84, the Celtics took them to 7 games and beat them on their home floor after being down and out in the rematch year. And it started out similarly, where the Celtics looked like they could take it again. And LA made a comeback, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar got in his hot tub time machine and went back to his prime. And he was the Finals MVP, and the Celtics lost on the parquet floor, which really ended, I guess, at least in Pat Riley's mind, because he's quoted as saying it ended the Celtic mystique and the Boston Garden mystique. It was one of those surreal moments. Now, unfortunately, that was probably the year that I don't necessarily remember. I remember the loss. I don't remember the feelings or the emotions that my older brother, my father, my stepfather were going through, but it was hard to swallow. And you often see quotes from Larry Bird where he says, "I just didn't play up to my potential this series," and you're not really sure where those clips are coming from or where he 89-90 loss to the Knicks in the first round. No, it was 85 in the finals where Bird just couldn't do it. His elbow was killing him. There was too much turmoil on the bench with what was going on in the locker room, what was going on with Maxwell, and really led to the parade of Max, because at that point, Auerbach and Cedric Maxwell really had falling out. And if you notice, when did Max have his number retired?
Oh, that was boy.
Not very long ago.
It was not, and he's actually the most recent. He's the last one to have had his number retired. Obviously, the next guy that's going to have that done is Pierce. His number was retired in '97, I believe it was.
That late? '97? No, I believe it. At that point, they were at the Fleet Center. Yeah, '95 they left the Garden. So '97, and it was also, ironically, I believe, and maybe you can research this a bit, but I believe it was the year that he became the color commentator on WEI. So almost sounds like it was, yeah, I'll do it if they retire my number. Now,
I actually take that back. His number 33 was retired in 1977 at his Charlotte college.
31 he wore, I believe.
Yeah, his number was retired by Boston. Let's see.
Like 05 or 06?
Yeah, I don't have the number on that, but you're right. It was very recently.
And ironically, after Red was at a point where he was, an honorary, president of the team or whatever, and there was a major falling out there, and obviously in the last couple of years, Bird and Matt released that book together, and I know there was bad blood about that regarding some of Larry Bird's comments about Cedric Maxwell, but he's gone. It led to his ship being shipped out because he was, the year earlier in Game 7. In '84, he said, guys, get on my back and I'll lead you to the championship. Well, in '85, he sat on the bench for most of the playoffs. Hampered by injuries, but also bad attitude and some issues in that way. So it ended up with Max being shipped off into exile with the Clippers and Bill Walton coming in.
Yeah, and that's where the next point's actually going to bring us to is that off season, like you said, we saw Maxwell sent off to the Clippers, and Bill Walton brought in, of all people. Walton suffered from some nagging injuries, especially to his feet, but magically he found the fountain of youth that season, and let's talk about that 1986 season. I mean, critics, experts across the field, along with some of Jordan's Bulls teams, put that 1986 team as one of the greatest of all time. Where do you see that team standing, and talk a little bit about that season, what you remember from that season?
I certainly, in my mind, the 85-86 Celtics and the 86, 87, 88 Lakers were the two best teams of all time. Not to discount Michael Jordan's dynasty in the 90s, because as time wears on, all wounds, they heal, and, I obviously hated Jordan very, when the Celtics were competing against them, but at this point now, you look at Michael Jordan and his contributions, and you say, the best guy ever to put on a pair of Nikes. Let's not forget, the Celtics, most of them wore Reeboks. But the point being, that 85, let's say 85, 86 through, 88, 89, and not to give the Lakers credit here, but those years were so competitive in the NBA. And you had some of the most recognizable names, even to this day, playing against your team, be it whether you're a Philly fan or, whether you're a Sixers fan or a Celtics fan or a Lakers fan, your competition was harsh. So these teams were absolutely phenomenal. In my mind, of course, I'm a diehard Celtics fan. I always put 85, 86 above everybody. continuity was there, and Walton fit in perfectly. I mean, you had the starting five of, and it was the same starting now for 2 seasons. You had Bird, Parish, McHale, Ainge, and Johnson, who, could play basketball with their eyes closed and know where the hot sugar was or where their teammates were. Then you had a guy like Bill Walton coming off the bench. Definitely has the ability to score, but what people underrate about Walton's game, or don't talk about, I don't know about underrate, but don't talk about, was his passing ability. And these Celtics in 85-86 had such an uncanny instinct for their teammates that was surreal. And then after that, Scott Wedman coming off the bench, Jerry Seaston coming off the bench. I mean, you had a second unit that was healthy and formidable. We look at, I can remember really distinctly looking back at 09-10 when she came on board, and we were saying our second unit is, in a lot of ways better than many of the league's first units. And that may have been true had they been healthy. Well, this 85-86 team was healthy, and their second unit, they had a bench. They were great. Not to mention, they were pissed off about 84-85. The loss to the Lakers put a dent into Celtics history. We talked about the Mystique a little bit, put a dent into that. And these guys were determined. I think the only letdown of that season was, that turnaround shot from Ralph Sampson that eliminated the Lakers, because the Celtics and their fan base wanted the Lakers in the finals. Had they met them, they would have won.
Yeah, I mean, it's
in my mind, that's the greatest team of all time. You can't put Jordan's Bulls against, position for position. You can't put Jordan's Bulls against the 85, or probably the 85-86 Celtics and the 86-87 Lakers. Position for position, you can't, because yes, you have Michael Jordan. You have a great wingman in Scottie Pippen, but after that, where do you go?
Yeah.
Who's going to dominate Pippen? Larry Bird's going to. Jordan's going to dominate everybody. But who's going to guard Parish or KYRIE?
That's one of the things. That's one of the things about those Jordan's Bulls teams is, as great as Jordan was, his supporting cast really didn't. Obviously had Pippen, and later on he had Rodman, but there really wasn't as much as this '86 team did. Was the star power there on the Celtics? Obviously with Larry Bird, but there was also star power again, like we said with McHale and Parish, and let's not forget DJ, and
Ainge was bordering an all-star at that point.
Exactly. So top to bottom, a roster as a whole, there's no doubt in anybody's mind for a complete season you'd rather have that 1986 Celtics team over any of those Jordan's Bulls teams. Just because of the not only the talent that was on the team, but the depth and how deep that talent pool was for the Celtics team. And obviously, like you said, they won in 1986. They won the championship. It was a disappointment that it wasn't LA, but a championship's a championship at that point. And that off season, the thought process across the media was that the rich only get richer. The Celtics had made a trade early on that brought them the number 2 pick in the draft. And as crazy as it would sound, that number 2 pick was actually the beginning of the demise of the glory years of the Celtic organization. They decided to choose Len Bias out of Maryland that season, and later on down the road, we saw Reggie Lewis drafted with a 22nd pick a year later out of Northeastern. Talk a little bit about both of these guys, Len Bias and Reggie Lewis, and the beginning of the demise of the Celtics as we know it. Health issues started to become a factor, and started to wear on some of the big three. Some of the guys started to retire and work their way out of the system, and obviously the Lewis and Bias situations had a severe impact on the future of the team.
Yeah, I look at Bias, and from a memory standpoint, I remember my brother really talking about Len Bias, and how he was going to catapult this team into another dynasty, and then he died. And it was like taking the pin and putting in the balloon and letting it deflate, you know. Bias has been called on record publicly, you know, could have been equals with Michael Jordan. He could have been the guy who gave Bird an extra 3 years on his career. He could have been the guy who, you know, led the Celtics to 2 more championships before, you know, the inevitable decline of the original Big Three. And these are all could have beens because Bias never stepped foot on the parquet floor for gameplay. He never wore a Celtics uniform. These are could-haves. And I'm not discounting the impact on the Celtics that Len Bias has had. Obviously, it was huge. But when you think about Reggie Lewis, here's a guy who came out of nowhere. Like you said, he was a 22nd pick in the draft, and he sat on the bench for a long time, 88 through 89, 88, 89, even into 90. He spent a lot of time on the bench. It really took time to grow into the player that he would eventually become. But we got a glimpse into that. We got a glimpse into what Lewis can do as the next star of this team. And then, you know, on a spring day in May, he was taken from us pretty much on the basketball court because he collapsed on the floor. I remember my brother saying, "Oh no, not again," because echoing back to Bias. But it was so eerie because the way that he collapsed, it was like his body shut off. And then I don't even know how long, maybe a month or two later, it was in the off season, after, you know, he insisted he was still okay to play, you know, on a practice court, he passed away. And the NBA didn't allow the Celtics to remove Lewis's salary from the salary cap. And I believe that really is the one situation that put the Celtics into 20 years of basketball purgatory. You know, at that point it probably would have been, 14 years or whatever. But I'm not discounting the Bias situation because Len Bias obviously could have been the future of the franchise, and Bias and Lewis alongside of each other. But who's to know Lewis would have even had the opportunity or been drafted had Bias come along. The Bias situation is he never put on the grain of light. You know, as much as we hear about Larry Bird traveling, you know, down to Maryland to play one-on-one with him and, you know, make sure this is the right pick and how much Auerbach, you know, vetted him or whatever you want to call. Doesn't really matter because he never wore the green. Lewis did, and Lewis could have kept the Celtics at least competitive for the next decade. And that is, from a basketball standpoint, not a human life standpoint, but from a basketball standpoint, that is tragic.
And you know, it's tough anytime you invest a number 2 pick in the draft, and it fails, no matter, you know, if it's an injury-plagued guy or.
Honestly, not to interrupt you, the Celtics. I mean, typically the NBA champions don't have the number 2 pick in the draft.
It's you know, especially where they were coming off the championship year, to have a pick that high. You know, that's
right. So my point being, I don't want to remove Bias from the equation, but I don't like to use Bias as the all-encompassing excuse for why the Celtics fall apart in far distant recent years now. But Reggie Lewis, we saw him. We saw him grow from a player who knew nothing really but shoot and defend to a player who learned how to be unselfish, learned how to trust his teammates, learned how to play alongside of a legend, shoot the big shots throughout the entire game, but when it came to crunch time, he give the ball to the legend.
Exactly.
You know, Reggie Lewis grew alongside of these players, and we saw it. I'm not discounting Len Bias, but we never got to see it. Who knows if Len Bias maybe would have conflicted with Jimmy Rogers a year later and would have been traded. We don't know. But we do know what Reggie Lewis gave us, and we do know what the away from the Celtics by not allowing them to take Lewis's salary off the cap.
Well, you provide a good segment into what is actually going to be our final question before we wrap this up. You briefly touched in that Jimmy Rogers was brought in, followed up by Chris Ford as the coach. Both had relatively short stints as coach here. After the Casey Jones era, Nick, the Celtics went with Jimmy Rogers as their head coach. Kind of a tough period of time in the start of the dark era of the Celtics. Can you give us some thoughts on Jimmy Rogers, and then later he would be replaced by Chris Ford, and give us your thoughts on both coaches and their coaching styles, and what came of the team during this period of time?
Yeah, well, Casey was definitely a tough act to follow. Real players the players loved him. He knew enough to know that his players were smart enough to, make decisions on the fly and didn't need to be overmanaged or overcoached, which really sat well with Bird and DJ. And then as Casey retired, he went into the front office, I believe, and Celtics, a tradition, they hired from within. Jimmy Rogers was a long-time assistant coach. After bringing Jimmy on, let's not forget 88, 89, Jimmy Rogers came on. Bird only played 6 games that year. The big trade happened, trading away Danny Ainge. They brought in Joe Klein, I believe Ed Pinckney, and Jimmy Paxson came on board. Paxson, the Celtics, they managed up, I think they ended up right at 500 and lost to the Pistons in the first round, and that wasn't bad without Larry Bird. They were led by Kevin McHale, so all in all, Rogers' first season may have been considered a success under the circumstances, but what was to follow was disappointing. In 88-89, like I said, Bird was out. Celtics got swept, I think, by the Pistons in the first round. I know it was the Pistons, and came back the following season. Bird, recovered from the bone spurs. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. New team. Bird's back. Celtics should be able to compete, and a lot of discontent in the Rogers camp as far as what Dennis Johnson's role would be. Paxson and Bird did not hit it off well. Let's not forget Bird was coming off of 87-88 was his highest scoring point total. I think his highest total in every category. So the year before being injured, Larry was spectacular, probably his best offensive season, and got injured, came back, and like most players do, maybe tried to rush it a bit, and there were actually unheard of. There were complaints about Bird's shot selection in some areas, and Paxson was a lot of the guy who was causing a lot of those problems, and Rogers just didn't handle the situation well. So Jimmy Rogers, 2 seasons in, Celtics 89-90, they out first round. Rogers goes, Dave Gavitt comes in to replace Jan Volk, so it's pretty much Red semi-retired. Gavitt comes in, hires from within again with Chris Ford. They had almost gotten Mike Krzyzewski. I know he came up and had dinner with Red and was very close to accepting the job, but eventually Chris Ford took the job, and that led us to 90-91.
Now, I know injuries were a big part. They really plagued the Celtics, especially during the Jimmy Rogers time. Do you think
really the Chris Ford time? I mean, it really got ugly then.
Well, Bird had his back issues, and Kevin McHale was dealing with, I believe he had the ankle injury, and he also had that broken foot that was kind of nagging injury. Do you think that the I don't want to say failures, but underachievement of the Celtics during the Jimmy Rogers time is more because of Jimmy Rogers as a coach, or do the injuries have a large part to blame in that?
Well, I think the injuries did, but don't forget McHale was still on the tail end of his prime. Parish played better basketball as he got older, and Bird coming back, he had a really rough first half of the season in 89-90, but the second half of the season, I think he averaged 28 points a game. He finished the season at 25 points a game. So I think more maybe the players being unable to accept the limitations their bodies were putting on them with injuries and whatnot, and then on top of that, the coach not being able to bolster morale certainly had a hard. And let's face it, he didn't have an easy job coaching, Johnson, Bird, Parish, and McHale. I mean, not the easiest guys to coach, especially a grumpy, injured, out of his prime Larry Bird, or coming out of his prime.
Especially.
So, really, Rogers. I mean, not necessarily Rogers definitely wasn't the guy for the job as far as the big three were concerned, but the injuries really kicked in after Rogers left. I mean, that was when 90-91, I think Bird missed 22 games, so it started really going downhill. After the Bone Spurs came back and played 79 games in 89-90, and then 90-91, that back just gave out on them.
And that's actually bringing us up to the next point is under Chris Ford, the big three started to fade off into the sunset. During the Chris Ford era, we see Parish go off and sign with Charlotte. Eventually McHale and Bird retire. Talk a little bit about the Celtics under Chris Ford. Who Chris Ford was and what happened during this period. Ford was actually one of the longer tenured coaches under the Celtics. He spent quite a few seasons.
If you add his assistant coaching, he's very, very long tenured. Let's not forget, Chris Ford came, I think, from the Pistons. He was the first player in NBA history to hit a three-point shot, and he did it for the Celtics. He was a shooting guard on the championship team in '81, so a teammate of the original Big Three. Then moved into an assistant coaching role, I believe, when KC became the head in '83-'84. Ford's style, again, I mean, I really liked Chris Ford. I had the privilege of meeting him a couple times, and he was super nice. I thought he did very well integrating the younger players with the older players. Let's not forget, 90-91, Celtics released Dennis Johnson, or they don't re-sign him, which was a real area of contention with Bird, who was very close with DJ. And they forced Brian Shaw back from Italy to take the point guard role. Reggie Lewis was coming into his own, and Kevin Gamble was a very good candidate for Most Improved Player of the Year. I think the year prior he averaged 4 or 5 points a game. In 90-91 he averaged 15, and I believe he led the league in field goal percentage. And then D. Brown was a rookie. So Ford did a great job of integrating the youth. The Celtics started out that season, I believe, 25-5. They led the East. And then somewhere around Christmas, I remember they had a game against Chiefs, and Bird didn't make the trip. And I remember thinking in my mind, that's the end of Larry Bird. And for all intents and purposes, it was. I mean, he did come back the following season, but was never the same, only glimpses of himself. So, concentrating on Chris Ford, I know from reading and doing research that there were some areas where Bird and Ford didn't get along. Ford was a barker. He liked to scream and yell. Much different from Casey Jones. Jimmy Rogers was a blip on the radar, so you can't really even factor him in. And Chris Ford was determined on the Celtics running, playing an up-tempo style of basketball, which was pretty shocking for a team that was, up in age. Their core was really comparable to our core now. And I remember in the news, Bird made public comments saying, "Oh, we say that every season, and we never end up doing it." But they did. Ford made them do it, and with Parish, Bird was the best defensive rebounder in the NBA at that time, even past his prime. So you had a guy who could defend the glass really well and was one of the better outlet passers in the NBA off the defensive boards. So kicking off the break, Bird didn't have to run much. Robert Parish was probably the best selective fast breaker in the league at that time. If you watch video back from those days, Chief got a lot of his points right on the fast break. And here's a 37-year-old guy out running 22-year-old centers. And then, of course, the younger players just fit in really, really well with that style. So, really, I remember 90-91, they were really in contention to come out of the Eastern Conference until McHale got injured in Seattle, Bird got injured before the game in New York, and the end of the season, I think, 56 and whatever.
It's an interesting point to bring up the Celtics offense at that time. I mean, and you mentioned the current core big three with the Celtics, and for some of the more modern fans that weren't around in the 90s, it's almost amazing if you would put it into perspective. You would have this current group from the big three running Miami's offense, and it's just almost unfathomable to see to even think about Kevin Garnett, running a fast break right now in his condition, and this original Big Three at this period that we're speaking of was older than this core group, correct?
Yeah. I mean, 90, 91, Bird they were similar in age, believe it or not. I mean, besides Parish was 36, I think, at that time. Bird was 33, McHale was 32. Those guys fell apart young. You have to remember, I mean, they went on a fast pace from 80 until really 88, really 89 until Bird got injured. They were in the finals every year, and if not the finals, the Eastern Conference finals, so they were playing a hell of a lot of basketball. And, not to go back to the Bias situation, and they never use Bias as an excuse, but Bias passing away, they traded away or let their bench go, clearing cap space, and that forced Larry Bird to play 40 plus, and McHale to play 40 plus minutes a game. I think I was looking back in the old career totals, and I want to say Bird averaged 37 minutes a game in 1991 on a broken back. I mean, that's incredible. So the age difference was very similar to today. And it's almost unfathomable when you think back. You listen to the NBA today bark about the Big Three today, and I think to myself, boy, these guys, they're not that old. I mean, neither were Bird, Parish, and McHale, but similar circumstances where you had a guy like Bird, like those three played so many minutes. So did KG. I mean, he came out of high school.
Yeah.
Ray Allen played a lot of playoff games. A lot of bad, and it never stops moving on that court. So those legs have locked a lot of minutes too. So very comparable, Nick, to today. Very comparable.
Yeah.
And also comparable to the fact that the Celtics were very emotionally attached to their roster and monetarily attached to their roster, to where they had to write out the original Big Three and go into what we would consider somewhat of the dark days for the franchise. Similar situation to today, where Danny. These guys are more valuable to us than they are to other teams at their age. What we're going to get back in return is never going to cover the investment put into these guys or what they can give us. Very similar to back then. Exactly,
and that's that's a big area of a sticking point with Celtics fans right now. When is the time to pull the plug on this unit? And really, like you said, there's going to be not the return that Celtics fans would expect. I know there's a lot of the irrational thoughts of trading Kevin Garnett for Dwight Howard, and there's all those irrational trades that would come out. But
not to get off topic here, but why would Orlando want to trade, Dwight Howard, who's a young buck, for Kevin Garnett, who, believe me, I wouldn't part with KG in the world. In my mind, he's a lifer Celtic now. Those Minnesota days are forgotten. He's been a Celtic his whole career in my mind, but yet he's more valuable to us than he is to another team. What GM in their right mind would trade away Dwight Howard for Kevin Garnett at 34 years old, who's injury prone?
Well,
and he's clearly past his prime.
What team on that thought? What team would trade away any young talent? Because let's face it, Celtics fans are going to want a young talent for giving up Kevin Garnett, and I can't think of any GM in their right mind that would give up any kind of young talent right now, other than one that would have personality issues for a guy that might have 2 more years in the league, and that's exactly what the Celtics were facing. That's what the Celtics were facing in this early '90s period with their Big Three, and the only one that would go on to play elsewhere was Robert Parish, who would eventually joined Michael Jordan and the Bulls on, I believe it was their 96-97 championship team.
The only member of that team, of that Big Three, to have a 4th title of that team, really, because DJ had a title with, I believe, Phoenix or Seattle, one of the two.
Seattle, yep.
And was the MVP. But don't forget, DJ only won 2 championships with the Celtics, so he comes out with 3, matching Bird and McHale. Parish, who was primarily a role player at that point, but I remember him getting some crunch time with the Bulls, but minimal, sucked it up, sat on the bench, and picked up a 4th championship. So he's ahead of Bird and McHale in that area.
Parish would actually go on to be the leader in games played in NBA history, I believe. I was looking that up recently, and I know he was up there, if not at up top. I mean, the guy played for almost 20 years.
We touched on it a bit earlier, and Robert Parish is just so underrated. What his impact on the league, on the Celtics, on centers, what his impact was on young players for conditioning. I mean, Robert Parish, you think of him as injury prone because down the stretch he seemed to always hurt those ankles in the late 80s. But I mean, in 1991 he played 79 games, and I believe in 91-92 he was right around there as well. So, I mean, here's a guy, 37, 38 years old. His first cover on Sports Illustrated was in 1991, and he'd already been in the league 15 years at that point. And,
so we're also talking about a big. We're not talking about a point guard, but, traditionally bigs, especially in this day and age, they don't last very long. And, the knees will give out, whatever, we see with Yao Ming, the feet give out, Bill Walton, same thing. Bigs don't last well.
We talked about this earlier as well. Parish, not only, a big who had longevity, but a big who played against some of the greatest bigs of all time.
Exactly.
I mean, he had to defend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Moses Malone, Patrick Ewing, Olajuwon, Samson and Olajuwon in '86. I mean, he had really, it wasn't like he was sitting around and slouching on defense. The guy was a great shot blocker, a great rebounder, and he ran the court really well for a big man.
Exactly. Well, Nick, I appreciate everything, your contribution to this. All of your input will be added into this upcoming book on Celtics history that I'm going to be working on. We'll have this as a podcast on the website fairly soon. And, I really appreciate all your input, and I hope the fans enjoy a little bit of a history lesson on the Celtics, and hopefully they look forward to hearing some more.
Nick, I think you can tell for the 2 hours or so we've spent, discussing this. I love to discuss history, the history of the franchise, especially that era of the 1980s. I think it's just such the golden age of basketball. And doing it with you is a pleasure because not many fans or even, guys who cover the team are as passionate as you are about the team and want to learn and want to put your own free time into making a better experience for fans, reading your book and whatnot. So really it's an honor to have been here, an honor to have you as part of our staff, and look forward to reading the book when it's published.
Well, I thank you very much for those kind words, and I too look forward to long future with you in the program, and here's to some more history lessons for some of these great fans in Celtics Nation. This will conclude the interview with Nick Gelso from Celtics Late Night Show and CLNSRadio. And again, I thank you for all your input.
Yeah, appreciate it. Good times, and I'll talk to you soon.